Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis 29, we're calling this one The Deceiver is Deceived. Acts 17:11 reminds us to be good Bereans who receive the word with great eagerness, but we examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. Might be a good time to recap where we are in the book of Genesis. So in chapters 1 through 11, we looked at the prehistory, that was the creation, and then the pivotal event known as the fall of man in chapter 3. Chapter 4, we looked at the story of Cain and Abel. Chapter 5 was the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and that contained that description of Messiah coming down and rescuing the despairing. So that was a great picture there, giving them rest. And then we have the flood of Noah in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. Then we have the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations in chapters 10 and 11. Then in chapter 12, we looked at the study of Abraham, and then we begin to have a change where we move from prehistory, what we might call the first family. So Abraham, and then a little bit on Isaac, and then we're right in the middle of Jacob. As soon as we're done with Jacob, we'll look at the story of Joseph. Genesis 29 begins with Jacob encountering some people at a well, and they will take him back to Laban, and he will make an arrangement to marry Rachel, who is his beloved, but he will actually be deceived into marrying Leah first. And then he presents the situation to Laban, and Laban says, well, we can give you a 2-for-1. So Jacob ultimately marries Rachel, and then the chapter will conclude with the story of Leah's first 4 sons. So we have Leah and Rachel, and their marriage to Jacob is a tenuous one at best. There's trouble with the first family. Jacob is deceived into marrying Leah first, but as we said earlier, he later marries Rachel as well. Rachel will end up being Jacob's favorite. Now, there's strife between them because whenever you have more than one wife, it just never works out that well. But the strife then becomes a type as we work through the rest of the Bible. The 2 sisters will come to represent 2 kingdoms. As you can see on the map, mostly the 12 tribes of Israel. We've got some of the northern tribes cut off for space, but you can see Ephraim and Judah are really the heavy hitter. So Ephraim ends up coming from the line of Rachel, and Judah ends up coming from the line of Leah, and these become the power player. So you have David, Solomon, and then after Solomon dies, the kingdoms are split, with Judah really leading the way in the south, and then Ephraim leading the way in the north. So where we have two people with interpersonal strife in Genesis 29, those are going to become 2 nations of strife down the road. Also from Leah and Rachel, the Jewish sages see 2 messiahs coming from each line. So there'll be a Messiah who rules and conquers like David from the tribe of Judah, and there'll be a Messiah who suffers like Joseph. Joseph is from Rachel's line, and that is called the Messiah ben Joseph. So how do they get this? Well, as the sages read each of the messianic prophecies, they notice that they tended to fall in 2 seemingly conflicting areas. One group speaks of a Messiah who will conquer, and the other group speaks of a Messiah who will suffer. Therefore, logically, pre-Jesus, it's easy to see that this is probably 2 separate people. However, Christians, of course, we have the benefit in more ways than one of Jesus, and Jesus is both. He is the Messiah ben Joseph and the Messiah ben David. And interestingly enough, his father's name was Joseph, and he's from the house of David. So you've got that hint of both Messiahs, in one person. And the first coming was to suffer like Joseph, and the second coming will be to conquer like David. I think this is a reminder, to the extent that parts of Scripture are not revealed to us, we need to hold on to that very loosely, because it's God could have a completely different way that He's going to carry this stuff out versus whatever we might come up with in our minds. So we just need to make sure and let God be God and not speak for Him where possible. One theme that emerges in the Gospels is that you see even the disciples want Jesus to be the conquering Messiah, and the passages on a suffering Messiah are much less popular. And so they were guilty of picking and choosing what scriptures they wanted to believe in. And again, we're at risk for doing the same. This is why in our teaching videos, we begin every lesson with Acts 17:11. We want to be Bereans and students who search the scripture, making sure we're being taught the whole counsel of God and making sure we're keeping everything in balance. So in Genesis 29, Jacob is now coming into Haran after making the roughly 500-mile journey from Bethel down at the lower end of the screen. It's not on the map, but it's between Shechem and Jerusalem. This journey probably would have taken him around a month, and it's likely he followed the same route that Eleazar took. In Genesis 24, there was a common road that they took in those days. Unlike Abraham and unlike Eleazar, who traveled with large entourages, remember Eleazar had 10 camels that he needed to give them water, Jacob fled in haste, and he probably brought very little with him on this journey. He may have even been wearing Esau's clothes that he had put on to deceive his father. So who knows? It's interesting to think of he might even be carrying the weapons of his deception, if we want to call it that. Then Jacob set out on his journey and went into the land of the people of the east. Then he looked and saw a well in the field. Behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, because they had watered flocks from that well. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep. Then they would put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. So we have some intentional similarities with Genesis 24. Jacob is appearing at a well just like Eleazar did back in Genesis 24. Genesis 24:13, behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to water. The setting described in these verses is one where water is scarce, and there had to be closely monitored agreements about who could access the well and how much they could take. Now, we need to remember that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So there's a lot of detail in the first 8 verses of chapter 29 that is not really relevant to our story, but we assume, at least I assume, it had more relevance to the original audience. All of this detail about the well agreement, and then the men who wouldn't water their flocks until a certain time, which we'll look at in the next passage. So we have this large stone covering the well, and the size of the stone turns out to be significant. There's an incidental aspect of Jacob going to be lifting it on his own, but we're about to see a group of men who are unwilling and unable to move it. And so the stone becomes symbolic of a problem that we'll uncover as we work through this. This large stone over the well served to keep animals and debris from inadvertently falling in. This picture is of a pit in modern-day Jordan that is probably around 5,000 years old. So you can see the stone to cover such a pit would have been large and quite heavy. May have been even used to hide the well from casual observers. Jesus will use this type of setting in Matthew 12, which, interestingly, we just studied in our gospel study. So he's going to ask, which of you has a sheep that falls into a pit and will not rescue it? So you had the stone would have prevented the sheep from falling in. Jacob said to them, my brothers, where are you from? And they said, we are from Haran. So he said to them, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. And he said to them, is it well with him? And they said, it is well. And here is his daughter Rachel coming with the sheep. So like Rebekah, who appeared before Eleazar, Rachel is the first woman to appear at the well before Jacob. So another parallel with Genesis 24. We're going to see this term Laban, the son of Nahor, and we're going to remember that it's actually Laban, son of Bethuel, the son of Nahor. And it's a reminder that as a biblical idiom, the Bible often uses son of to mean any direct descendants. So people will compare the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew 1 and Luke 3 and see that there's discrepancies. Or really, it's just they're just using this idiom. Matthew actually edits some names out for reasons that we talked about when we covered that in the gospel study. So just remember, when you see son of, it doesn't necessarily mean a father-son relationship. It often does, but it can mean any direct descendant. Rabbi Plishkin is going to note something unique about when Jacob says, my brothers, and that'll be our first walking in the dust of our rabbi thought for this chapter, is that we want to treat everyone with dignity. And Rabbi Plishkin noted it was Jacob's practice to speak in a polite and a friendly manner to everyone. Therefore, he called these shepherds, whom he had never seen, my brothers. And it's a reminder that when we're out and about, we're going to encounter people from all walks of life. Some will be, socially, economically beneath us, and some will be above us. But as Paul says, we should not view anyone as beneath us. We should, in fact, view ourselves as the lowest. So Philippians 2, 3, and 4, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. It's debatable how much Jacob did this, but at least on the surface, he was greeting these strangers whom he had never met with some respect. Then he said, look, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them. But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered, and they roll the stone away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, this is an area where we don't have a lot of detail about what is happening here in 7 and 8. We have to remember, like I said earlier, the Bible was written for us, but is not written to us. Probably this had some more significance, some type of agreement that was in place that day. And really the narrative would have been just fine had it gone from verse 6, talking about Rachel, to verse 9, where Rachel appears on the scene here. One Jewish source speculated that Jacob believed these men were working for Laban and might have been cheating him, perhaps in exchange for some retaliation that Laban had swindled them, so they're kind of back at you. So in other words, they were calling it a day around noon and kind of slacking off, and then they would go back and put in their timesheet for a full day's wage. Jacob, as a shepherd, picked up on this and reminds them that there's still work to do. The men do respond to this, and we aren't told why they're either unwilling or unable to roll the stone away. But again, we have this picture of the stone representing an obstacle, which we'll pick up in a second. There could be a thought of wicked, lazy servants, such as we see Jesus referencing in a few of his parables. Bad shepherds is also going to be a theme picked up by Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then even in John's gospel, as he's comparing Jesus, who is the good shepherd, to the religious authorities who should have been good shepherding God's people, but they weren't. Kind of maybe they answer with, well, we have an agreement. The reason we're not working is because we have an agreement that we have to wait before watering. So who knows? Note that Rachel came to the well in the high part of the day, in other words, high noon. And when we looked at the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, you remember that Protestant commentators love to draw this conclusion really out of thin air, that she must be one of loose morals because only women with loose morals come alone to a well in the middle of the day. Well, here we have Rachel coming to a well alone in the middle of the day with her flock. So Rachel is clearly not that kind of woman. So we just need to check those theories and make sure we're letting Scripture be our first source of commentary, commenting on Scripture. The woman in John 4 perhaps is fallen based on other textual clues, but not because of the time of day it was. So again, we just need to be good Bereans and check things out. Now, in the ancient world, we have this thought of a shepherdess, and it was unusual because it was a rugged occupation. And so a woman would only be a shepherd in a family that was without sons. And so you can flip it around. Rachel was, a formidable force to be reckoned with here. So it's probably contributed to Jacob's love at first sight. Not only was she beautiful, but, she had the muscles to go along with it. And so we have this theme where it says we cannot roll the stone away until some other people come and do it. So we've got some kind of spiritual obstacle occurring throughout the Bible. So let's watch what happens to the stone as the story unfolds. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother Laban, and the sheep of his mother's brother Laban, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of his mother's brother Laban. So say that 10 times fast. We have another Genesis 24 parallel. He's watering the flock just as his mother watered the camels of Eleazar. So these parallels are continuing. Remember, the stone was very, very large. So Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well. This was a true act of feat. And if we have any thoughts of Jacob as a weakling mama's boy, we just may need to check that with what's happening here. Of course, he's potentially showing off for Rachel by doing what the other men are unwilling or unable to do. But in any case, he does move the stone away. And so this kind of represents, we have this mini drama here with the stone uncovered and they can't move it. And Jacob comes and saves the day by rolling the stone away as a spiritual victory. And so, of course, that reminds us of the biggest victory in all history when the stone of Jesus' tomb was rolled away. So Mark 16:3, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb for us? So while the stone was closed, we were all defeated by death. But when it was rolled away, that's when death was arrested and our life began, as the song goes. Of course, not the stone itself, but the stone, again, is symbolic of this spiritual barrier. So before Rachel had arrived, the stone was blocking the water and, representing an obstacle to Jacob's mission, but Jacob comes along and moves it. There's an interesting play on this is when the Israelites are preparing to cross over into the promised land, they had forgotten to obey the commandment to have their males circumcised. So all throughout the 40 years wilderness wanderings, they did not circumcise. And before they go into battle at Jericho, the Lord appears and says, guess what? Guess what y'all got to do? And he refers to this as rolling away the reproach of Egypt. So we see again, this rolling away represents a spiritual victory. So something to think about as we read our Bibles. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and raised his voice and wept. Then Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran out and told her father. So when Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his house. Then he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, you are certainly my bone and my flesh. So we've got these kisses, and although Jacob is smitten with Rachel, this is probably just a familial greeting and not at all romantic. But what is curious is that it's the same Hebrew word, but in verse 13, there's an emphatic form of the verb used here, whereas when Jacob kissed Rachel, it was the simple form. So we aren't told exactly what the reason is for the difference, but when we know Laban's past history, and if we've read ahead, we know what Laban is about to do to Jacob, we sense some kind of Laban's getting a little excited about this new potential mark that has appeared on his scene. So we know what motivates Laban from Genesis 24. He told Eleazar the servant, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord." So this kiss here may suggest potential trouble ahead for Jacob. It's interesting that Jacob's first recorded kiss was his deceit to his father Isaac, and now he receives an emphatic kiss of a deceiver Laban. So Jacob clearly has Laban's attention here, and we'll just kind of watch how that unfolds. It also says that Jacob raised his voice and wept, and it's interesting that there is a theme in the Bible of people weeping around Rachel, and this recurs in Scripture. And if you remember the birth narrative of Jesus, we have this note that a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because there were no more. Now, this was written by Matthew in response to the killing of the innocents, the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem. In context, he's quoting Jeremiah, and Jeremiah sees Rachel's weeping as a foreshadow of the Jewish exiles. So the Bible just has a lot of weeping by and over Rachel. So later in Genesis, we're going to learn that Rachel has trouble conceiving, and this will become a source of strife in Jacob's household. She will have a difficult pregnancy with Benjamin, her second born, and she will end up dying in childbirth. So Jacob will actually mourn this loss to his final days, where in Genesis 48, he's going to recount those details. This also foreshadows Rachel's premature death, because there's going to be a scene where Jacob issues a curse, and that inadvertently Rachel will be the subject of that curse. And so the thought is that she will die and have a premature death. So it's interesting. A Jewish source, non-Christian, recorded that Jacob, with his weeping here in Genesis 29, foresaw that Messiah, son of Joseph, will be killed. On foreseeing this, Jacob lifted his voice to weep because he saw the sorrows which his children would endure in their exile. For their exile is closely connected with the death of Messiah, son of Joseph. I found that fascinating. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in figure and appearance. So we have another Hebrew idiom here. When it says her eyes are weak, a lot of us tend to think that is a put down, or she's ugly somehow. It actually means her eyes are tender and delicate, and in Hebrew idiom use, that is actually a compliment. When it said someone has a good eye, that means that they're generous, and if they're described as having a bad eye, that's a Hebrew idiom for stingy. So let's not we don't assume Jacob was repulsed by Leah and smitten with Rachel. He was definitely smitten with Rachel, but it wasn't because Leah was hard to look at. Basically, what I think it's saying is that Leah was nice, but Rachel was stunning. So Leah's positive attributes paled in comparison to Rachel's external beauty. And so remember that mankind, and specifically this man, Jacob, what God says in 1 Samuel 16:7, this man looks at the outside, but the Lord sees the heart. Or man looks at the outside, but the Lord sees the heart. We're going to learn that Messiah is actually going to come from the line of Leah. And so we can ask how many overlook, Leah's son because he is not eye-catching. Isaiah 53 verse 2, he has no stately form or majesty that we would look at him, nor an appearance that we should take pleasure in him. So our eyes can deceive us. Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you, he's talking to Laban now, 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Laban said, it is better I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed like only a few days because of his love for her. So what is happening here? There's a typical, John Walton records that a typical bride price was around 4 years' wages. So Jacob is in a weak negotiating position, and in a scene somewhat reminiscent of the bowl of porridge with Esau, Laban is going to take advantage of this, and he's going to command a premium price, 7 years instead of the normal 4. So we may look at this and see, oh, how romantic. There's actually more going on here. Despite having inherited all of Isaac's and Abraham's wealth, Jacob didn't have any of that with him. He left that all behind. So working for Laban was the only payment that Jacob could offer. So when we pursue eye-pleasing things, those often come with strings attached. So Laban essentially says, again, come in, O blessed of the Lord. He's saying, stay with me. He probably knows that whatever Jacob touches will be blessed by God. So, let's keep him around for a while. Let's string him along and see what we can get out of him. That's kind of what I view Laban as saying in his head. So from Jacob's perspective, he became emotionally attached and he didn't hide it. Now, once you have to have something, anyone who's bought a car knows this, you give up the option to walk away. And once that happens, the negotiation's over. And the salesman knows it. And they're going to get a deal that is not at all favorable to you and highly favorable to them. So again, pursuing eye-pleasing things comes with strings attached. And in this kind of a typological sense, the world selects Rachel over Leah because she's eye-catching, and in so doing, they miss the Messiah. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my time is completed, that I may have relations with her. So Laban gathered all the people of the place and held a feast. So this is a wedding feast. Now in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and Jacob had relations with Leah, with her. Laban also gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a servant. So it came about in the morning, behold, it was Leah. So the trickster has become the target of the tricked. The deceiver is deceived. So again, this theme that's going to run through Genesis of concealed identity. What probably happened was the bride would have been veiled throughout the ceremony, and she remained veiled until arriving in the bridal chamber. Remember, there's no electricity there, so it would have been mostly, if not entirely, dark. There also may have been a sense where Jacob's senses were dulled because of wine during the ceremony. We aren't told either one, but we're just trying to piece together what we know about the context. So both of those, either one or both of those may have been contributing factors. But it's interesting that because of this ruse in Genesis 29, in modern Orthodox weddings, the groom is allowed to lift the veil of his bride just prior to the ceremony to make sure he's marrying the right girl. So I think that's kind of funny. In any case, this is sowing and reaping, and we have this thought of Jacob deceiving Isaac when Isaac had dim eyes, and now Laban is deceiving Jacob when his eyes were dimmed, either because of lack of light or because of alcohol, and he exchanges Rachel for Leah and her weak eyes. Now, instead of being unattractive, it could be that they looked enough alike to make this ruse possible. So let's keep that in mind also. And he said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why have you deceived me? But Laban said, it is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. And there is a sense here that Lancaster raises. The boys, Esau and Jacob, were destined to marry Leah and Rachel respectively. So when Jacob acquired the firstborn status from Esau, he unwittingly agreed to marry Leah first. And he did say to his father, I am Esau. So that's a Jewish tradition that Leah thought all along she was going to have to marry Esau, and this made her sad. So again, we wonder why Laban didn't just mention this earlier. So a lot of commentators suggest Jacob was blinded by love. Marrying the eldest daughter first was a custom that Jacob should have known and honored. Who knows? We don't know if that's true or not. In that day, though, if a younger daughter were married first, that would communicate that there was something wrong with the older daughter, who then might never be married. So there is kind of a practical reason for all this. But if this was a national custom, why didn't Laban just say so? Well, that's not how Laban rolls. Laban is a grifter, and a grifter is only successful to the extent that they can keep more information than the victim has. And I think what happened here is he saw a chance to marry off both daughters at once, and so he went for it. We have to give Jacob a little bit of credit here. He is understanding. He wants to know why this happened before he reacts. And we have to compare that with Esau's immediate vow of vengeance. And this will lead us into our next In His Dust discipleship application. So we remember that the fruit of the Spirit, one of the fruit is self-control. And so regardless of the circumstances of the deceiver now being deceived, I think Jacob demonstrates an amazing level of self-control. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. So we are going to be wronged in this life, and let us at least be like Jacob here, where we have a little bit of self-control when we are wronged. I mean, today, if someone fails to perform on a contractual obligation, it's immediate phone call to the lawyers, or angry words are exchanged, or there's some other form of retribution, and that is reacting to a wrong that's done to us. That's what Esau did. And as we like to say, understanding is greater than reacting. So Jacob seeks to understand the wrong done to him, and he actually doesn't object to Laban's explanation. Yeah. So he says, what is this you have done? And so we have to conclude that Jacob got a satisfactory answer. At least he didn't dispute it. So ostensibly there was a valid reason for the switch. Now, this doesn't excuse Laban's deception, but here Jacob is taking the high road, and we should too when people wrong us. Complete this week of the one, and we will give you the other one also for the service which you shall serve me another 7 years. Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. So Laban here, he's making a counteroffer, probably what he wanted all along. He wanted both of his daughters married off. There's actually a little bit more tension between verse 27 and verse 28 than we might realize. At this point, Jacob could have objected. He could have legally repudiated the marriage on false grounds, and then basically annulled the whole thing. And this would have been a severe blow to Leah's reputation. She's now no longer a pure bride, would have practically ruined her chances for a future husband. And of course, it would have insulted Laban, who likely would have withheld Rachel from this. So Jacob was in a bit of a bind, but ultimately he agrees, and he agrees to serve a little bit longer for Rachel as his wife. So Jacob obviously wants Rachel, so no price is too high, and so he consents to the marriage with Leah in order to get Rachel. The bridal week here probably refers to 7 days, a literal week, alone with Leah, where the bride and groom would have been, relieved of other tasks in the hopes that a pregnancy might ensue. So Laban also gave his female slave to Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her slave. Jacob had relations with Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah. He served with Laban for another 7 years. So polygamy is, clearly not God's design. He ordained in the garden one man and one woman. And whenever you see polygamy, it just doesn't end well. And there's all kinds of strife and messy situations. Specifically, Leviticus 18:18 forbids the marrying of two sisters. You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a second wife while she is alive. So all of this will become prohibited down the road, and it should have been prohibited here. But Jacob is so smitten with Rachel, he will take her at any cost. So he serves another 7 years. The text is clear that for Leah, Jacob had worked 7 years, and then after the 7 years, they were married. Instead of making Jacob wait another 7 years, it appears Rachel was given after the 7 days with Leah was completed. And then Jacob was on the hook to work another 7 years. So it's not like he had to wait 14 years for Rachel. He basically had to wait 7 years and 7 days for Rachel, and then he stayed on Laban's payroll for another 7 years. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, or some versions say hated. He opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to have children. Leah conceived and gave birth to a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. So we're getting into the birth narrative of the 12 tribes here, and it says that Leah was hated. And as a Hebrew idiom, again, we have a lot of those in this chapter, that is more of a comparative than an absolute. So we might want to say she was loved less than Rachel was. And we see this throughout the Bible, and even Jesus will say, if anyone comes to me, does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. That sounds like it's conflicting with the commandment that says honor your father and mother. Well, what he's saying is, he's not saying to hate them absolutely. He's establishing an order of preference. Love Jesus first and love others second. So we have this name of the firstborn is Reuben, and that is what's called a portmanteau, which is combining two parts of a word to make a new word. So like you have a meal that is neither breakfast nor lunch, but is something in between. We're going to call it brunch. So brunch is a portmanteau of breakfast and lunch. We have the eternal saw, and that is the Hebrew verb re'ah, and another form of that is re'u. And then he will love me as Yahavani, and you combine those together and you get Reuben, or in English you get Reuben. Reuben is actually going to forfeit his firstborn status through a sexual impropriety act, which we're going to read about in the next chapter. Then she conceived again and gave birth to a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me the son also. So she named him Shimon or Simeon. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi or Levi. Shimon relates to the Hebrew verb shema, which the command of that is shema, and it means heard or to hear. The verb shema, S-H-E-M-A, is the command to listen. So because the Lord has heard me, she named him Shimon. Levi is related to the word attached, Yilaveh, and so we get Levi in Hebrew or Levi. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi are going to all forfeit their next in line status. So Reuben will forfeit his in the next chapter. Simeon and Levi are going to be involved in an atrocity at a place called Shechem when they're back in the promised land. They will forfeit their next in line status. So their rights are going to fall to the fourth born, who is actually Judah. She conceived again and gave birth to a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. So Judah is related to Odeh, and it means I give thanks or give praise. So you have the third person form of that is Yudah or Yehuda. And then she stopped having children. So I think it's interesting that notice she changes her focus. So the first 3 sons are all about Jacob and the fact that she can't win Jacob's attention. With Judah, she focuses her praise on the Lord. So perhaps it's not a coincidence, and there are no coincidences in the Bible, that Judah, with focus on the Lord, becomes the preeminent tribe and indeed the line of Messiah. And again, there's no coincidences. So that does it for Genesis 29. We'll continue the story of the 12 tribes when we pick it up again in Genesis 30. So we'll see you then.